first of all, welcome you for joining us. Look at this. The screen suddenly changed. That happens on Zoom. Have you noticed? Anytime anyone different speaks, the whole thing rearranges itself and you got to relocate people. I want to tell you that we will have this posted on our website, and you should get a copy of it as well in your emails, and you should feel free to share it with others that might enjoy learning from our guest tonight, Georgia Kelly, who is a part of an economy of our own, an alliance of feminist activists and organizations working to transform an economy that seems to be growing a little bit more ruthless all the time, the bigger and more powerful it becomes. Georgie Kelly founded Praxis Peace Institute and has been one of our partners nearly from our beginning in late 2020, and has already appeared in three of the Zooms that I want to show you next. Carmen, if you could put up that first slide. Yeah, a conversation that is of interest to feminist economists often returns to this idea of shared responsibility and shared power of ownership. So no one knows more about this, I think, than Georgia, whose work for peace always includes economic justice. You can see that we've had 4 conversations about shared ownership, shared resources. The one on the left there, shared economy, was one of our first ones that included not just cooperatives, but also public banking. What if we all owned our own bank here? And then you can see that Georgia is here in sharing ownership, how co-ops work in women-friendly ways. Inside Mondragon, which was a great conversation. We'll talk more about that later. And tonight, the story is in our bones, a conversation with Osprey Orielle Lake. And you can access all of these and more on different topics as well at our website here at www.economyofourOwn/resources. So let's talk to the real Georgia Kelly now that you've seen how famous she is.
I don't know about that.
I'm so pleased to have you here because a lot of people don't really understand how an economy of our own is an alliance, a kind of growing partnership of feminist activists and organizations that we want to give ample attention to. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about your work at Praxis and how that started, and what you what you can share with us about your work with Mondragon before you introduce us to Osprey. Can I just interject, though, that we got a panicked email from Osprey, who was suddenly fearful that she was up for tonight. Excuse me. And I assured her that that wasn't the case. So
we have her on recording.
Right.
So
it's Georgia.
You want me to start?
Yes, would you?
Certainly. So I actually have been, I guess, involved with Economy of Our Own from probably the beginning. I think if you were saying it was in 2020, I know we were in lockdown with COVID. I never got it, but I think many people did. And a lot of things began during that time. And Zoom certainly became the way we all communicated. And I've been grateful to Zoom ever since and have continued working on Zoom a lot. We have a lot of Praxis programs on Zoom and attract people from different parts of the country that way. So we're not just Sonoma-centric anymore. So I feel really good about what Economy of Our Own is meant to do to empower women in economic terms, especially since we were not empowered that way when we were growing up. And so I appreciate what Ricky has done, her book Screwnomics, all that we've learned about how we've been kept down. I mean, I didn't realize it. I think at the time when I got my first credit card a few years before that, I wouldn't have been able to get one because I was a woman and I'd have to have a man sign for it for me. I didn't know that when I got my first credit card, but I learned it later. And I thought, wow, that's just amazing. That never would have dawned on me. So I think an economy of our own is really important in having us learn what the history has been and how pushed down we were for a long time. So my focus on peace eventually led me to economics. You cannot have peace without economic and social justice. And that became apparent with some of the conferences we were doing. We started at looking using peace building skills, conflict resolution, negotiation, how we work with each other. And I realized at that time that we were kind of scratching the surface. There was a lot more to learn. And as we kept the inquiry going in each of the conferences, it got to the point where, okay, we need to look at culture. How does culture shape the way we see war and peace? How are we manipulated to support wars? Or how are we manipulated because we don't get the whole story? We just get the story that will shape our thinking. So we started looking at culture and media, and then we got to the one I had always wanted to get to. Well, first, before we got to economics, we got to civic participation. How can our, not just voting, but how can we get involved in a way that means that policy can change? So this was something we looked at in a conference we did actually quite some time ago now. And then after that, we had one that was called the Economics of Peace. And we've been very focused on economics ever since. And that was 15 years ago. So what we have seen, economics has opened up a whole can of worms. It's the social justice aspect of it. It's the war economy that's so prevalent in the US. We are a war economy. How do we get out of that? Our economy is dependent on the war machine, basically. So much of our money goes toward that. What would happen if we pulled money out of that and put it toward peaceful initiatives, social justice, homes, homes for, well, like they do in Vienna, they have this wonderful public housing. It doesn't look like what we think of public housing because we always think of kind of dilapidated high-rise buildings. But in Vienna, they are nowhere near dilapidated, and they have studios to 3-bedroom homes in these public housing condo and townhouse buildings. They're beautiful with gardens on roofs and lots of like a park in between, gardens where people can grow their own food if they want. So this is the kind of public housing that would be fabulous to have in the US. So if we could take some of that money going to the military industrial complex, move it over to housing, and it would be extraordinary. It wouldn't take that much money. We're throwing a lot more away at the military. And so that's been one of the things we've looked at a lot, reallocation of economic resources from where it's going to where it could be going to create a really flourishing society. So we don't have that right now. And these are some of the things we've looked at Praxis conferences. And we're planning to do another one either this year or early next year that will again look at what can we do and what are some of the models that show us the way forward. And of course, the Mondragon cooperatives and the Basque region is one of those models. And what really amazed me about Mondragon, the first time I went, of course, I noticed, and this was 16 years ago, that there really was no poverty. There weren't people living in the streets. There weren't people pulling shopping carts around. There were no slums. So you notice this on the first trip, that this is pretty common throughout the Basque region. What I didn't notice really until my third time going there was that, oh yeah, they don't have poverty, but they don't also have great wealth. You don't see the mansions on the hills, the gated communities. It's a very different value system. And I think that's what I became really interested in understanding. They value things differently than we do. How do they? Why do they? And how this plays out in their society. And of course, one of the ways it plays out is it's an empathic culture. It's a culture where people care about people. So for instance, their research and development complex, which actually Ricky had told me I should start from the beginning, as if no one has ever heard of Mondragon, and I forgot to do that. So let me just spend a couple of sentences on telling you what Mondragon is. Mondragon is the largest complex of worker-owned businesses in the world. And it is in the Basque region of Spain, beautiful complex. And it's not co-housing, it's just worker-owned businesses. So the businesses work in this way. They're either, some of them are fairly large, like they make industrial appliances, they make bicycles, they make computer chips. So they're big. And they have the largest research and development complex in all of Europe. So they're very cutting edge. They're always kind of ahead of what needs to be created for the society next. Very bright people and very empathic, very, yeah, I think empathic is the right word. So it's a culture that you feel secure in, you feel safe in. You can walk around and you don't see policemen, and if you do see them, you don't see guns. It's a very different environment. So I love going there. I've been there 12 times. I'll be taking our 13th group this October. And we spend a week there learning about the businesses. We visit some of the businesses. We have lectures. They have lectures in this beautiful educational center that's in a renovated 14th century villa up in the hills above Mondragon. Beautiful place. And then we visit some of the businesses. We go to Bilbao and San Sebastian. We go to some NGOs, one that focuses on social transformation. It's like, how does a city or a community transform itself? And one of the most inspiring stories for me, from the first time we went, the Mondragon people took us to a peace center. And I think they did that because we were a peace institute. So we visited the peace center in the mountains that was next to a 500-year monastery. And we met the person who founded it. And later on, I learned that he was one of the instigators of creating a truth and reconciliation meetings between the victims and perpetrators of ETA, the Basque terrorist organization that had killed almost 1,100 people between, I guess it was about a 50 to 60 year period of time. And people were still frightened. I know when we still went there, we saw lots of graffiti on walls about separating from Spain and free the terrorists and this kind of thing. You don't see any of that anymore. It's all gone. And the reason why it's all gone is because Jonan Fernandez, who was head of the Peace Center, thought we need to bring the people together, the victims, the perpetrators, and not just bring them all together, but bring the ones most open to finding a path forward that wasn't violent. So he found those people, started working with them, and they said, yes, we can go forward without violence. We'll talk to everybody. And they decided, okay, we're done with violence. Nobody really believed it outside of the area, but I did believe it because I knew this man was very, very concerned and very focused on creating peace in the region. So he actually met with other people, even it was a group at Columbia University. It's in my paper about Mondragon. And they formed a group that met, I guess, fairly often. Within a few years, they decided to give up the weapons. They had maintained them because they were afraid of retribution. Finally, a few years later, they turned all their weaponry in. They said, we're done with all this. And we were there when they turned their weapons in with our group in 2017. And when we went back in 2018, we happened to be there at the same time they dissolved ETA. So it no longer exists. And it hasn't existed since 2018. For 6 years, it hasn't existed. And this has created a real change in the community. And I think, in fewer than 10 years, that whole cultural identification gone, changed, completely different. And that made me realize, when things can move that quickly, it's because people have, I'm hearing other sounds. I think,
Yeah, I am too, but I'm not seeing anybody who's not muted.
oh, that's interesting. Well, anyway, I'll go on. I won't go too much longer on this, but I think for me, Mondragon has been the model economically, culturally, peace-wise, that shows how humans can live on the planet, how they can transform in fewer than years than a decade. That's always, since we're up against a climate crisis, that if we don't figure things out in less than 10 years, we're in big trouble. So
Yeah.
I'm looking right now at what are the models where we could actually, that we can see change happen in less than 10 years. And the Mondragon example is one of those. They've done extraordinary things in very few years. And the paper that I wrote about it, I'll probably put in the chat in case people haven't seen it.
That's great.
Yeah, because it does talk about other changes that happened in short amount of time. One was regarding women. Women were very underrepresented because the Basque parliament, they have their own parliament in the Basque region. It's kind of an autonomous region of Spain. And they do have a Department of Peace, which they renamed the Department of Coexistence, Peaceful Coexistence and Human Rights. And they had noticed, as I think many women had told them, there were not enough women in the parliament. So a women's organization formed to change all that and get women involved in politics. And I think it went from something like less than 24% women in the parliament to 54%. That's what it is now. So it changed radically. Now there are more women in parliament than men because of this women's group that educated women, recruited women to run for office. And you see how extraordinary when people work toward a given target and say, this is what we're going to accomplish. We're not going to get sidetracked. We're not going to get, disoriented from what our focus is. And I think that was also a learning for me. It's like they don't get sidetracked. They know what their goal is and they move toward it without the distractions. And one can get very waylaid from a goal if you get caught in distractions. Well, people will say, well, what about this? You're not doing that. So how can you reach this goal if you're not doing my thing? And I think focus is so important. And I've certainly seen how they do manage to stay focused and not be distracted and yet are open. So they're a wonderful society to learn from, both in terms of the worker-owned businesses, which I'll just say one more thing about that before we move on to something else. Their pay ratio is one worker owner, his average salary. The CEO is only going to get 6 to 8 times that salary. They've made a few exceptions for a little bit more for people who are coming from the outside to be a CEO, but for the most part, they hold to that ratio. And it means that there's equality within the organization and solidarity between managers and CEOs and workers. And they respect, and they always say this in our seminar, we respect all aspects of work. And I saw that at the, the Alvarado Street Bakery in Petaluma, which is worker owned. And they say we respect every worker on the job, from the person who's the janitor who cleans up, to the person making the bread, to whatever, or the person doing the sales and the marketing. Everyone is equally respected. And that's the same model in Mondragon. So it gives you a sense of hope to see that it's working. It's not just an ideal, it's actually a model we can learn from. And the worker-owned businesses in the US have all learned from Mondragon and have adopted a lot of their ways of working and have the same ideas and the same working methods as Mondragon. So that has helped me believe that peace is possible with this kind of enlightenment. In our society, we have many things that need to change. And one of the basic things that has to change is, the fact that we are a war economy and how we change from a war economy to a people-centric economy. And that is kind of our challenge, how we move our society from that, because we really live in an oligarchy, not in a democracy, and the corporations making all this money from war basically kind of own the Congress. In fact, someone I was listening to the other day said there are more lobbyists for the military industrial complex in Washington, D.C. than there are members of Congress and the Senate. So they are being bombarded constantly by these lobbyists who are on the ground making war the important thing that we're funding. So this is something, you know, when you see the kind of propaganda we have in our media that's trying to get people to support wars instead of negotiations, we don't hear about negotiations anymore. And this is something that's very troubling. Russia, Ukraine, you don't hear about negotiations. You just hear about giving them more weapons. So we're up against this kind of thinking. And so getting to peace, getting to economic security in a culture is very difficult when there's one entity taking most of the money in the economy. So that's where we are today. I think I would be ready to go to the interview that I did with Osprey. Maybe I'll just set that up a little bit. I interviewed Osprey Orielle Lake, who runs a women's environmental organization, WECAN, and this is her book. The story is in our bones: how worldviews and climate justice can remake a world in crisis. And we've just been talking about worldviews. So you see how they segue into climate justice, how they segue into how
Sorry.
Okay. So it's these things all interconnect. And since we are in the Earth Day month, it seemed really important. And when Ricky asked me if I would share the interview I did with Osprey, I said, yes, this would be a great opportunity to share her work more widely. It's an excellent book that she's written, and it's really in detail, and her knowledge is extraordinary. I think one of the most knowledgeable people when it comes to environmental solutions. She has learned a lot from the indigenous community, as you will see in the interview, but she puts the pieces together in a somewhat unique way. And I think that's what's so important about her work. So afterwards, I would be happy to talk with any of you on this or answer any questions or hear comments, but I think we might be ready to go to the video.
Yes, I think so too.
Good afternoon and welcome to Praxis Peace Institute's Friday series on Zoom. I'm Georgia Kelly, the director of Praxis. Today we are hosting one of the most successful environmental activists who also has a wealth of knowledge and wisdom in crafting solutions to the climate crisis. Osprey Orielle Lake is the founder and director of the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network, which brought together 100 global women leaders to draft and implement a women's climate action agenda. She serves on the executive committee of the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature and has been a core organizer of various international rights of nature tribunals. Her writing about climate justice, women in leadership, and other environmental topics have been featured in The Guardian, Common Dreams, Earth Island Journal, The Ecologist, and other publications. She is the author of Uprisings for the Earth, Reconnecting Culture with Nature, which won the 2011 Nautilus Book Prize. Her latest book, which we are going to talk about today, is The Story is in Our Bones: How Worldviews and Climate Justice Can Remake a World in Crisis. This is the book. I'm going to highly recommend you get it. I just finished it and I'm just wowed by it, quite honestly. The detail, the heart, the knowledge, the research, the combination of it all is extraordinary. So I highly recommend this. The Story is in Our Bones. It's in our local bookstore at Reader's Books in Sonoma, and you can also get it on Amazon. And if you do, please leave a review. We want this book to go viral. So Osprey, welcome. It's wonderful to have you with us today.
Thank you so much. Enjoying being here and seeing all of you.
Yes, it's wonderful. I've known Osprey for a long time when we were both artists before we were doing the work we're doing now. So before we get into the book, Osprey, I'd like to hear about your experience at the UN Climate Summit in Dubai. Being held in an oil-rich country, as will also be the case later this year when it's held in Azerbaijan, I want to know how much of the summit is being used for greenwashing. Like, what's the percentage of greenwashing versus actual policy that will help the climate crisis? That's one question. And the second part of it, excuse me, I have to. Okay, excuse me, I have to mute people that don't mute when they come in. So the second part of the question is, what is the purpose and the ideas of the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network in attending these summits? How are they useful to you and your group? And why do you continue to go?
Great questions. So yes, the UN climate talks in Dubai, I think framing it to kind of even blend some of your questions together, I think is a good approach, which is that the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network, and certainly a lot of civil society organizations and frontline groups are not going to the COP thinking that everything is going to be resolved there by governments. So I think that's something to sort of remove from the table, because the systems in which the UN operates really are not necessarily the best conditions for a holistic and comprehensive approach to the climate crisis and resolving it at the level that the urgency requires. I mean, the COP in Dubai was COP 28. So 28 years later, we're still escalating the climate crisis. So that says everything about that process, if you will, in some ways. That said, it's the space that we have. It's part of an ecosystem of components of things that many of us are working on. I'm sure some of you who are on this call as well, where we need to recognize that the UN climate talks are part of the ecosystem that we need to navigate and utilize to our best abilities. It is the one space where all countries are meeting and having this discussion every year. And so it's extremely valuable in that way. But in terms of like our organization, and I believe others as well, it's just one of the things that we do all year. Not all of our eggs certainly are in that basket. We're doing so many other things on reforestation, protecting land, doing things on food sovereignty and food security, many other spaces of work on advocacy and projects. So I think it's important to put the COP in context that it is a space, it is territory and terrain that we need to keep pushing forward, because that's where governments are meeting. In terms of the actual COP in Dubai, it was extremely challenging, as you stated. We're in a, the presidency was led by someone who is head of a, oil company in Dubai. We were met with a lot of challenges there because of the government and what we were allowed to do and not do. This also happened to us in Egypt, where civil society is really being contained in the COP venue, and it's not safe or legal to protest outside of that space. So it's been really challenging the last two COPs, because we have been forced to stay on the premises and not do our usual large global movement marches on the streets. So it's been a very confined space and a lot of restrictions on the kind of protests that we can have, and the kind of the process of how civil society organizes itself has been really challenged by the last two COPs, and also in Dubai. That said, one of the main things of why we're there is that I believe, and I personally have a deep reaction to the fact of governments meeting without us being in the room. As they say, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And this is definitely a case where if civil society has not been participating in these COPs, things would be so much worse than they already are. The government's already, taking us in a trajectory that is terribly dangerous, with methodologies and ideologies and quote unquote solutions that are not really going to meet what we need to face in terms of really changing the trajectory of the climate crisis. But it would be so much worse if we weren't there. Just as a few examples, there would not be the 1.5 degree guardrail that is, baked into the Paris Climate Agreement if we were not all advocating in Paris, all of civil society with the pressure of climate vulnerable countries that were also advocating for this 1.5 degree guardrail. That would never have happened. And that 1.5 degree guardrail has been hugely important to the climate justice movement as we advocate since the Paris Climate Agreement that we have something to hold governments to, something to hold financial institutions to, something to hold corporations to when they say they want to be aligned with the Paris Agreement. We can show them how they're not because of that advocacy point. Just to give like one example, what happened in Dubai is that because of civil society and again, climate vulnerable countries, we were able to force a conversation that was never meant to happen in Dubai, which is the phase out of fossil fuels. That was forced into the discussion on the global stocktake, which happened this year and ended up having to be a core principle that governments had to deal with because of the insistence of all the demonstrations, the pressure of the constituencies that are from civil society. So, on the big scale, people are like, oh, the next COP failed. I mean, they're all going to fail probably at the context that we want them to. But there's all these other moving parts that are going on where civil society is pushing the agenda, demanding climate justice. In Egypt the year before, we won on loss and damage, that there's now a loss and damage fund, which is a form of demonstrating that we need climate justice, that countries who are most vulnerable, who have done the least to contribute to the climate crisis, need support from the loss and damage that they will experience because of wealthy countries. That fund has been fought for 30 years, and we finally won on that. Yes, there's all kinds of problems and loopholes in it, but these are significant markers that are pushing governments in a direction that they wouldn't normally go. And there is a huge amount of fossil fuel influence, as you were mentioning, Georgia. This particular COP had 2,400 around fossil fuel lobbyists, double almost from last year. It's absolutely insane. And a lot of the civil society constituencies are trying to figure out how to intervene with the UNFCCC to demand that there be a change in their policies about allowing all these, polluters, if you will, into these negotiations. We do know that the OPEC, right in the middle of the negotiations, as fossil fuel phase out started to become a rumbling, went and reached out to governments and said, don't go along with the fossil fuel phase out. Don't mention that. We don't want that. Stay focused on carbon emission reductions. So there was that direct influence of the fossil fuel industry. So yeah, it was challenging that way, but we did walk away with governments agreeing to transitioning off of fossil fuels in the energy sector. It's not the language we wanted. They should make a clear plan for a phase out, but we did achieve them finally talking about fossil fuels and knowing that they have to transition off of it, and we'll have to build on that quote unquote victory, which it was, but we need so much more to happen. So the last thing I'll say and hand it back to you is that I think we can't also underestimate what it means if you have a very clear objective to be at the COP where you have access. And there's so much going on in addition to the formal negotiations, which WECAN is very engaged in, like the Just Transition Work Program, the Gender Action Plan. There's things that we're very specifically tracking and have for years and push negotiators in the different rooms to do different things. But there's a lot going on, quote unquote, on the sidelines where, Indigenous peoples from all over the world are there. There's meetings with negotiators. There's opportunities to be right in the face of, the highest levels of government. The space is open. Not that you have instant access, but, you can walk up to John Kerry and make a demand. He's there, standing there. And, there's many opportunities with the delegations we bring of frontline, primarily Indigenous women, to directly talk to their country leads, to be able to be heard in different spaces. We have many different events, pavilion events, we have press conferences. So the intervention of what we're doing in that space is highly significant. And that's the value in going. And it's not going to be, paraded around in some flashy way. It's a lot of grinding, difficult behind the scenes work, but it's also a way that civil society is building power together, because we do all of these events and we learn from each other and we push each other's agendas and language and ideologies. And there was an opportunity to have civil society protest and demand for a ceasefire. And, people are like, what are you going to do about Palestine and Gaza when you're there? And there is protests every day for ceasefire at the highest levels of governments right there in that space. So I would just say that it's definitely not for everyone, but if you have a specific agenda and you're tied into, certain goals, it ends up being a space that it can be quite valuable.
Great. That's definitely a good explanation of why you're there every year. And I want to just ask, I just want a quick answer to this one, because I want to go into something then with your book. Do you think that a new kind of international organization, maybe something like a People's Climate Summit, should actually start being put together? Because the UN summit on one level is not getting the job done. I understand that you and other NGOs are getting a lot done, but the actual summit itself isn't. Do you think there's a place for a people's type of summit, or an international people's organization that will take on climate at a really systemic level?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's something that is discussed annually. There has been attempts by different groups to let's boycott the COP and create our own global climate context movement, meeting, some kind of convening or convergence. And it's not that those have not happened, and they continue to happen. And I totally support that and think that needs to happen. I think one of the most successful is when Bolivia held a conference right after a failed climate talks. That was probably the most successful in 2010, the early part of 2010. But the only caution I have, what I've seen, is not that we shouldn't do it, but we have to figure out how to bring enough momentum, because what happens is the reason that the UN climate talks get so much attention and people go is because the government leaders are there, and that's who we want to appeal to and push decisions upon. And so when I've seen some of these other configurations and formations, they end up not being as big or getting enough press or getting enough momentum. So I think they're important, but I think we have to see them sort of more, a collection of different convenings that would happen that maybe collectively together could create enough push and force. Because people tend to want to meet where they feel like they're going to have their impact. But I'm not against there being, another type of convening, but I think it would have to be sort of a collective one in different countries simultaneously.
Right, get it. Now I want to go to your book, because throughout your book, you make it very clear that capitalism as a dominator system can only view nature as something to be used, not a living system that we need to collaborate with. So I'd like you to talk about the problem of capitalism and implementing solutions to the climate crisis, and what you see as a possible remedy.
Well, it's such a huge, huge topic. And I see David Corton on this call, who probably could answer this very succinctly, and hopefully we'll come to the conversation on that, since he's an expert on this topic. I think we need to see it in context. And this is really what I'm talking about with the systemic change. So I'd like to just broaden a little bit around capitalism, because I really get into this topic in my book of these interlocking systems of oppression, capitalism being one of them, looking at endless economic growth models, or an extractive economy, which capitalism is. But exactly how that is intertwined with colonization, and how that is intertwined with patriarchy, and how that is intertwined with racism. And I think it's very important, if we're going to talk about climate justice or solutions to climate, that we have this larger framing. Because if we're really going to get at the root causes of the climate crisis, environmental degradation, and what many scholars are calling, a polycrisis, which also includes colonization and racism and misogyny, we begin to see these patterns of looking at root causes and then have the capacity to hold a systemic change big enough to address those interlocking crises, because it's hard to tug on one of them without tugging on the other. So we really can't have, the system of endless economic growth in capitalism if we didn't also have colonization, if we didn't also have racism. They feed each other, because capitalism depends on having places to extract from the land, places to practice endless economic growth and extraction, which means there have to be sacrifice lands where that can take place, which is mostly indigenous Black and brown communities, away out there somewhere, away from white wealthy people. And so we need to understand how they feed one another, and the whole idea also of colonization, and how capitalism and colonization are very intertwined in the sense of having land that you can colonize and people that you can colonize to then generate capitalism from that model. Tied into all of this is gender inequality, and the fact that we live in a very hyper masculinized world right now that's very out of balance. And one of the things that perpetuates colonization, capitalism, and racism is also gender inequality, and the fact that we don't live in governance structures that honor female and male leadership, or gender diverse leadership for that matter, in any regard, which also then creates these systems of hierarchy. And this is why I got into the topic of worldviews in my book, because I wanted to really go upstream and say, okay, what are the root causes of these systems of oppression that we've been talking about, and where do these belief systems come from, and worldviews that perpetuate capitalism, racism, colonization, and patriarchy. And so this is like, again, looking at these dominator views, this view that we have dominion over nature, men have dominion over women. There's white supremacy, white people over people of color or indigenous peoples. And this view of dominion over and these hierarchies are completely at the root cause of how we got into the climate crisis. So we have to really unpack them simultaneously and understand at the root, we need a very different relationship with nature and one another. And part of that is dismantling capitalism and colonization. Part of it is saying and inviting, how do we have a different economic framework that is not based on endless economic growth models, or views nature as something for us to use as our slave and to abuse over and over again. When we see the world as nature being animate, that we're relatives, that we're part of the web of life, that worldview completely changes our relationship to our economy, which would not allow for capitalism, because we don't destroy our relative. We don't harm the web of life that we're part and particle of. So I think we need to sort of see this in a very holistic way, and the interlocking relationships between these systems of oppression that have led to the crises that we're in.
Well put. I would love to delve into worldviews with you, but that could go on for an hour by itself. So I was very hesitant to bring that up, but I think this is one very important part of your book, where you go into different worldviews and what comes out of those worldviews, what they support, what they nurture or don't nurture. And that is a very important sort of philosophical piece in your book that I really appreciated. But what I want to go to right now is, I was quite moved actually by your description of the treks you took into the wilderness and the connection with nature that you've had really all of your life, a visceral connection. And that brings me to two things. One is I want you to talk about some of the WECAN projects that you've been involved in. And with that, I want to use a quote that you used in your book from a Belgian-Russian chemist, Ilya Prigogine or something like that. Don't know how to pronounce his last name. But he says, quote, "When a system is far from equilibrium, small islands of coherence have the capacity to shift the entire system," unquote. So I'd like you to talk about some of those islands, because I know you've been involved in them. So tell us about some of your work in some of those islands.
Yeah, great. And thanks for pulling out that quote. I really resonated with it as well, because I also think it generates hope, in the sense that it's so overwhelming and there is so much massive destruction going on ecologically and socially that, how do we view how change happens? So it's a very profound, not just theory of change, but the fact that it is in science something that actually works, I think is a really hopeful lens. So maybe I'll just mention a few of the projects we have that just, have popped into mind when you asked the question. One is we have a project in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which we've been working on for about 8 years, which with a wonderful WECAN coordinator, Nima Namadamu, who's a dear beloved friend. I met her at a big conference that WECAN put on some years back, and we just really had a wonderful connection. And we did, through a series of trainings and a lot of listening circles, we determined that it would be really successful and powerful to start a reforestation project in the Atombe rainforest. And as some of you probably know, second to the Amazon rainforest, the Congo Basin is the most important forest we need to protect in terms of size and what it means to the overall ecosystems of the world. I mean, and also including, I would say, the boreal forest and the Indonesian forest. But those 4 forests are absolutely key. And in this one area where we're working, it had been through slash and burn techniques. And again, because of capitalism, colonization, and mining in the DR Congo, just absolutely devastated. I mean, there's sort of areas I've been to where there have been clear cuts or logging, and you still see some foliage and stumps. I mean, this land was like nothing. We're just talking to the ground, nothing green. And so over the course of the last 8 years, there are probably about 900 to 1,000 now women in the program. It's women-led, and they're reforesting vast areas of the Atombe rainforest. And 25% of the trees are for human use and what they need on a daily basis as Indigenous peoples there. And 75% are growing back, rewilding the land. And we're to the point now, which I didn't realize it would happen this, relatively quickly in 8 years, which is we've grown enough trees that a huge amount of the population is now no longer going to the old growth forests. So we're simultaneously protecting 1.6 million acres of old growth forest, because now it's being left and not, they're using the wood, the forest that we've grown. So it's also become a forest protection project. And then we've planted enough trees that Mother Nature is now intervening, in the sense that the rains are coming back. We're cooling down the land. The rains are coming back. In the last few years, we've seen what we're calling wild nurseries, in addition to the nurseries where we're growing saplings. All this forest is popping up because of the rains returning. And so it's just been an incredibly inspiring project to see the land coming back, reforestation taking place back. And the social component is that in this very patriarchal, violent society, these women are being empowered because, they're the one leading the project. Some of them, we fly to different regions to speak at conferences, and their stature in the community has gone up. The respect for them as leaders has gone up. They're also getting income from this. So it's been just, very holistic at many, many levels. So that's like an island of hope and coherence that we're working on. And then I would also mention, different areas where we have food sovereignty programs where, we are looking at how it's very likely the climate crisis, environmental degradation will increase and get worse for a while. I'm holding out and hoping that things will then get better, but right now, there's going to be more storms, floods, droughts. I mean, we've locked in a lot of climate chaos. And so how do we create, and first we're looking at frontline communities. So mostly we're working with Indigenous women leaders around, how to create food sovereignty, bring back traditional ecological knowledge, create these hubs that also have emergency centers that can also be places of safe harbor for when there are catastrophes. So we have some projects in the Gulf South and in Oklahoma supporting Indigenous leaders and creating these hubs where there can be, locally grown food, local medicines, and create a lot of, sustainability, their own solar power. Like, how do we create these hubs of livability and protection and safe harbor? So we're looking at that as well. And then I think the last thing I'll mention is, something more that's at the advocacy level, because I consider advocacy also islands of hope and change, which is, we are on the executive committee of the Rights of Nature. And this is if you're not familiar with it, it's a form of law that really sees nature as a living entity. And currently in our legal frameworks, nature is viewed as dead matter or property. And so we really have nature caught up into a legal framework that supports capitalism and colonization because we see nature as a commodity. And what rights of nature law does, it says, no, we need to remove nature from the marketplace. We don't want the commodification and financialization of nature. We need to see nature as the sacred life-giving entity that nature is. And so I really love this whole idea of rights of nature because it really turns the DNA of our legal systems upside down and puts Mother Earth in the center and ensures that the economy and our governance structures respect the natural laws of the earth, respect the planetary boundaries. And so it really is a powerful framework and that really hold this moment of how we transform both our legal frameworks around nature, but also our economy. And lastly, I would just say that rights of nature is not just an idea. In Ecuador, rights of nature became part of the Constitution in 2008, and cases have been won around rights of nature laws in Ecuador. In the United States, there's been over 36 local ordinances to stop fracking in communities or harmful projects from coming into a community, asserting rights of nature laws. So yeah, I think that rights of nature is a specific area of work that is becoming a huge, having a huge impact globally in Colombia. I mean, there's been so much growth in that movement. Even the UN Secretary General at the end of last year said that earth jurisprudence or laws that are pertaining to philosophies of earth are the fastest growing environmental movement in the world. And rights of nature is a part of that.
Right. I have other questions, but I think at this point, since we've gone past the half hour, I want to open it up for some of the participants on the call to ask questions if you want. And when I call on you, you can unmute, but please stay mute otherwise. Is Ricky still here?
Yes, I am.
So we finished with the video. And now I guess we want to see if there are any comments from people who are on the call or questions.
But I just make a comment. I just love everything that you had to say about the importance of peace and an economy that's we like to say it, an economy of our own, that it's waged as war. And it's true that war is certainly at the center. The making of war is at the center, but the whole attitude of extraction, of patriarchy, of domination is a war think head wrap that we're trying to undo and talk about. One of the phrases that Osprey used that I really loved was this hubs of livability. That's a wonderful phrase. Hubs of livability, and the hope that, seeing those models that are working makes such a difference. Mondragon is certainly one of those.
Yeah, it's like it's very similar to what was described as islands of coherence.
Yes.
There are these hubs, these islands where people have figured out basic things that we need to learn from them. And there's indigenous cultures that have done this. There certainly Mondragon, but there are other cultures that we don't study because they're not part of the story that our culture tells. This is something I discovered when we did a peace conference. We did 3 peace conferences in Dubrovnik, Croatia. And one of the reasons was it had been a city-state. Dubrovnik had been a city-state for almost 600 years. And during that time, it had never gone to war. And in its constitution, they kind of made pledge not to go to war, and what were the things they needed to do to prevent going to war. So they created a state that would not need to go to war, and it worked. They never did go to war. So I thought, why didn't we ever learn about this? You know, when we learned history, why didn't we learn about this republic that for 600 years was way ahead of its neighbors? You know, the Venetian Empire was at war, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, but there was this little Dubrovnik city-state, no war.
Mm.
But we don't ever read about it. We don't ever hear about it. And I thought, you
I
know,
can point I
we
can
don't-
point to another example, Georgia.
Okay.
I remember being shocked when I discovered that our founding fathers, with whom we can find some fault, right? But they were very much against what they called a standing army. They did not want to see a standing army, and of course, that's part of the reason for that. What is it? The Second Amendment, I guess, that is now interpreted to mean that everybody should be armed. That's not what they were talking about at all.
Right.
But they didn't want to have a professional army in place because they thought that was dangerous. And I guess you and I would agree with that very much.
Yeah, very much so. And I do think the reason why we don't learn about that is because it's not part of our cultural story. Our cultural story exonerates the hero, the war hero,
Yeah.
individual who triumphs. We have this sense of glory that is not in keeping with peace.
Mm.
And another thing I noticed in Dubrovnik is they don't have statues to heroes because they don't have heroes. So you don't see statues in the old city. Well, there is one, but the statue to this one man who was a wealthy commoner left all his money to the city for the people in the city. So they decided to have a statue of him. But that's it. There are no other statues. So they don't have this. It's almost like a religion that we have in our political culture. They don't have it. And I think because it's not part of our story of dominating, of conquering, of grabbing the land, since they didn't do that, they're invisible to us. That's what I think. It's like those models are invisible unless people like us pull them out and say, look, this has actually happened in history. Every culture doesn't go to war. It's just the only ones we learn about go to war.
Right. Well, I wonder if it's time for us to invite some questions from our audience here at An Economy of Our Own. Do we have any questions would you like to put any questions in the chat? Do we have any?
Oh,
A lot in the chat.
Oh,
I'd rather talk.
Diane would rather talk. I would rather have you talk, Diane. Thank you
Yes,
for
definitely.
raising your hand.
I get tired of emails. I get tired of emails and writing in chats and everything. So yeah, Georgia, I just loved when you appeared before on AEOO. I went through and I listened to your recording, did all this research, and I just so appreciate it because I don't know why. I guess I was doing a talk on co-ops or something. But anyway, I just so appreciate you. But I heard that you said you were doing a podcast every week, and I am not catching it. So.
Oh.
So is
Yes.
that true? And yeah.
Let me give you the website. I'm going to put it in the chat box.
That's right. This is just one lucky sharing, but in fact, you just had an interview with the founder of Earth Day.
Yes, with Dennis Hayes.
Yes.
I just interviewed him. That was my most recent interview, and then we had a discussion. We have a free discussion for our members once a month, and we just had a discussion with David Corton on economics. What was it? Economics for an eco-civilization, and he differentiates between egonomics and economics.
Oh,
So that was an interesting discussion. And the week before, I interviewed Dennis Hayes. And then next Friday is off because I'll be out of town. But the following Friday, I'm interviewing a legal scholar, and we're going to be talking about the election and the problems of autocracy and how close we are coming to it and what we need to do. So that will be on May 10th. So yeah, almost every week we have a program at Praxis. And I'm going to put right now the paper I did on Mondragon. I just attached it to the chat. It's on Mondragon and the Basque culture.
Great, thank you. We have a question here from Elizabeth Green. Elizabeth, would you rather, I'm just going to rephrase your question here in the chat. What actions can individuals take to end the environmental devastation caused by war and APAC buying legislators? Those are two very different subjects, but they're sort of related, and you touched on that already, Georgia, with
They're
the
very related. They're very
yeah,
related because
yeah.
between the APAC lobbyists and the, I mean, it's almost like the Congress people are afraid to move in a different direction. We're not getting leadership from our congressmen and our senators. Very few are really leaders. They're followers. They're following the status quo, which is supporting the war machine, supporting APAC, supporting and not negotiating. It's like the State Department doesn't negotiate anymore. I don't know what purpose they have if they don't negotiate. So what we can do, I think, this is really a difficult one because we're up against a mega machine. I mean, the military industrial complex is huge.
Mm.
And they have been wielding power since the end of World War II. So, and it's only gotten worse and worse and worse. Their influence has gotten heavier and heavier. And I remember when Lynn Woolsey, who was our representative in Congress, said, well, there's, 30 lobbyists for every congressman. Well, there's many more now. 30 is nothing compared to what there are now. So I think we're up against that. And if we could organize on some level, and this is difficult to even conceptualize, but we would need to be able to have organizations that could be lobbying in DC as relentlessly as APAC, as relentlessly as the Pentagon, as relentlessly as Raytheon or Lockheed or any of these munitions manufacturers. That's what we would need. We would need to have that kind of people power in DC to I think, challenge the status quo ownership of our Congress and Senate.
Or perhaps institute public financing for elections so that we don't have majority millionaires and billionaires in Congress.
Yes.
The Congress might look very, very different and not be as interested in being sold as some of our representatives are.
Yeah, I think it certainly would help. It wouldn't get rid of it, I don't think.
No.
Because we had it before Citizens United. It's much worse, of course, with Citizens United. So it
Right.
would help greatly if we could get rid of it. But we still are dealing with a mindset, a value system, a culture, a belief that there's a military solution to so many problems. And of course, that just ends in more people dead and more destruction. So I think we would have to create people power at the level that the money power is. We've got the people, they've got the money.
Yes. I wonder if, well, I think about all of this a great deal, but at the moment I'm thinking that education, of course, is what, Georgia, what you're doing, and it's what we're doing at an economy of our own as well. Education of people who are so busy. I mean, a major question that I wish the younger generation would ask is, why is it that my grandparents were able to support a family with a comfortable lifestyle and even go on vacation sometimes and have a pension, on one 40-hour wage.
Mhm.
How did that happen exactly? And why does it take 80 or more hours for many families? And even then, with everything, all the prices going up, what's happening exactly? It's complicated, but education is certainly a piece of it, making it understandable. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, yeah, it does. I think education is really important, and having examples we can point to and how
Yes.
they is part of that education. And then actually doing it is the next level. So there's those three levels, the educating, and then it's also, I think, pulling down the indoctrination we've all had. That
Right.
it's dismantling it, deconstructing it, so that
Mhm.
we have a space to create a new story. And I think that's then the models will make sense, because we'll see it, we'll have a place to put them that won't all be filled up with the old story that's dooming our planet, both
Hmm.
environmentally and peace-wise. That's a long thing that I see on the chat. Was that the one that we just talked to?
Well, it's Elizabeth Green who is talking about, she's with the Green Party. And so, Elizabeth, are you here? Would you like to talk about the Green Party a little bit and what you're doing about the environment?
Maybe she's not
Well,
here.
I offset my own carbon footprint. I spent a decade saving the rainforest. I have just, started recycling, stopped littering, all those things, vegan, all those things as soon as I found out about them. I've always done the right thing, and come to find out there were people who just weren't doing that. And there is something called the Darwin gene, and there are people who have mutations in the Darwin gene who are hyper selfish. They have hyper selfishness syndrome, and rigid bureaucrats are very highly represented in that group. So I can understand why we're having problem with government. And I think there's a lot of possibilities in the future of how we can help them heal. But I think letting them know that selfishness is a mutation. It's not how human beings are supposed to be. We're supposed to be altruistic. So let's just start an economy of altruism and just give each other everything we need, except for the selfish people, and let them fight each other off for whatever they're going to fight each other off for, and just not give them our money. Just stop buying whatever they're selling. And so that's a solution, just my personal solution. But I see that if we can make a drastic change, like, for example, if the 63% of voters who do not want to vote Democrat or Republican decide just to sign up for the Green Party, just register Green, just to show them that, there's an alternative. What if 50% of all voters register Green? That would be the majority party. And then the selfish people would have to either change their ways to try to get those people back coerced under their power, or they would just lose in the election. Over.
Well, I think we have to look at the practicality of this. I had belonged to the Green Party a while back, and I don't now, because our system is set up to not be able to allow a third party to have any power in the country. And because of that, I don't imagine voting third party the rest of my life, unless something really changes with our system. But it can't work right now. And maybe it could work it can work on the local level, but on the national level, it's too rigged. The whole thing is rigged. The Electoral College, they have so many safety gears for the two-party system that it can't be breached. And I think that's something we have to face, that it can't be breached. 53% or 51% of the Americans who don't vote are not going to join a third party, but enough could join a third party or vote third party to give us Trump. And I think this is, I know some people don't see a difference. There's a huge difference on a domestic level. On the international level, maybe there's not such a big difference, and that's frightening to me. But on the domestic level, there's a huge difference. And I think anything that would help Trump get in office is a disaster. I mean, women's rights would be just gone. I mean, we would suffer so much from another Trump, 4 years of Trump, that I think we can't look at it that way. And I'm sorry to say, but I've been where you are, and I just see that it didn't work, and it's not going to work under this system, except at the local level.
Elizabeth, I think your notion of a Darwin gene is interesting, but I also think that culture plays a huge role in shaping attitudes, because we have seen such a dramatic change in civic discourse over my lifetime, and that's a cultural phenomenon, to my view, and social media seems to have given everyone permission to be ruder than they would ever be face to face with one another. So I still have faith in the human race as a whole. And but I do think that American individualism has just gone awry. And I think there is a toxic, masculine culture, hyper masculine culture, that is hard for young men to escape, because men seem to police one another to make sure they're all tough enough and no crying allowed. And there's lots of ways to keep people in line. So that's my 2 cents on that subject too. But I appreciate your thinking about all of this and writing to us in the chat. The Green Party is certainly an important element on the local level. I'd agree with you, Georgia. So let's take a look at, are there any other questions? Anybody else want a chance to engage with Georgia or talk about what you saw from Osprey? I'm not seeing.
Hello,
May
this is Mary Gandolfo.
Oh, hello, Mary.
I had a question. I put it in the chat about what you were saying, George, of the Dubrovnik city-state.
Dubrovnik, let me put it in.
Yeah, and could you spell that out so that I could look that up and learn more about that? Because I think
I put the name in the chat, and originally it was called this. The old name of it was Ragusa, but since, I don't know, maybe the 1800s, sometimes they changed the name to Dubrovnik. It was a city-state beginning in the 1200s, and it lasted until 1808, when Napoleon came into Dubrovnik supposedly to be friendly, and then took it over, kind of like a Trojan horse. So that was kind of the end of the Republic, but for nearly 600 years, it was its own city-state with embassies in different parts of the world. Almost all the known major cities in the world, they had an embassy there. They were a port. They are a port still. So they had a lot of trade between the East and West going through the Dubrovnik port.
Okay, thank you. What country is it in, located?
Today it's in Croatia.
Okay, thanks.
Beautiful place. I was just there in September.
Excellent. Thank you.
Rianne Eisler, who is also part of our alliance at An Economy of Our Own and has her Center for Partnership Systems, who really gave us this basic information to think about as feminists, this range of behavior from domination to partnership and the ways those interact and the cultures that they produce. And she and Douglas Fry collaborated on a book called oh dear her book is called something guarding our humanity. Help me out, Georgia. Do you remember?
What is it? It is something hard. I can't remember.
Nurturing our humanity,
That's it.
how domination and
That's it.
partnership.
Nurturing our humanity.
Yeah,
book.
it's a wonderful thick book, but
Brilliant.
also talks about an older history, a history older than the patriarchy, which is actually only about 5,000 years old. So it's in line with the creation of militaries. Before that, it was very common for people to, given a choice, do I want to encounter this unfriendly tribe over here, or do I want to move over to this other part of the forest? That people would move. They just, it was just a sensible thing to do to avoid conflict. And so it's kind of reassuring to know that that really was our history, and that maybe part of what we're seeing is just our um, our overpopulation of the planet, our overuse of the land, and not thinking about the kind of public housing, for instance, that you were talking about in Vienna, Georgia, a very different kind of public space with a expectation for beauty and comfort. And one of the things about the Vienna housing that I think is exciting is that no matter how much money you earn, if you started out in this beautiful housing, you don't have to leave if
Right.
you earn 50 cents more than you're supposed to,
That's not just for people who can't afford better.
Yeah,
There's middle class in it, and they don't want just one class of people in it. So
that's
yeah,
right.
it's
Yeah.
really a good model. And I wanted to mention something that you said too, and that Elizabeth did, is the Franz de Waal, who recently passed, was a anthropologist at Emory University, and he's written several books because he studied bonobos for over 30 years, 35 years. And what he realized from that is, we have in our history and in our DNA makeup, we have the possibility of being like bonobos, which are very peaceful, or chimps that are not very peaceful. And we have both options, both possibilities. And I do think I agree with you, Ricky, that culture has a lot to do with which of those are going to be nurtured. Are we going to be nurturing the peaceful bonobo type in our DNA, or are we going to nurture the warlike aggressor dominator type? And there's a choice there, but it doesn't seem like a choice when you're in a culture that is completely focused on one of those ways.
Yes.
And not only not focused on the other, but not in any way honoring the other, putting it down. And it used to be put down as feminine. So that was a put down, which, something we're overcoming, but that's,
It's
that's
still there. It's still out.
it's still there, right?
They use ruder language these days than feminine. All right.
Those are the mega-hatted.
Yeah. Right. So we're getting close to time to wrap up. I want to just give one last call for a question or a point that someone wants to make.
Ricky, this is Katanya.
Hey, hi.
And so, what's really on my mind as we talk about our economy is the supremacist march that went through my downtown area just a couple of blocks away from where I live. That we had a beautiful event called the Race to End Racism, which is put on by the YWCA. And so, a huge charge of women to not only end racism, but bring everyone together. You could walk, you actually could even lay down on a bed for the race and make it through. Just fun events and beautiful things. And then this male driven white supremacist group with masks over their faces and uniformity in their clothes, carrying the flag. And interesting enough, they shouted, "America cannot be bought."
Mm.
So we go from a situation of collaborativeness, of joint vision, of raising each other up, to these male walking through, hiding their faces, screaming, "America can't be bought," as they say, America, because a couple of our African American reverends engaged them. They said that America is for the white man. and that they own everything, and went through this idea that somehow all of us as women, as African Americans, did not contribute to the health and wealth of this culture that we have. And they say these things as we continue looking at West Virginia. Instead of fighting the chemical plants that are coming in, they're calling those jobs. Instead of fighting against the fossil fuels still being harvested away, they coal forever and never die kind of things. And it's just interesting. Saturday had both ideas standing there, one encompassing unity and strength, and the other there with masks on, tearing it. And I just think, and then we're having this discussion now about how this occurs. The EPA considers West Virginia an environmental disaster.
But what strikes me, Katanya, is they're claiming they can't be bought. And that's so interesting, because I do think that a lot of MAGA hats are convinced that the game is rigged. They're feeling like they're cheated. Now they're feeling cheated because they've been so privileged, and they don't want to admit that. But in a way, it's the 99% of us, or at least the 90% of us who are facing who have been bought in a way by corporate power. And what we're looking at is not a market economy, but kind of an auction block economy, Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, well, thank you for sharing that. It's very interesting. I hope
It is interesting. Please go to our West Virginia YWCA site to see the pictures almost side by side. Put in race, West Virginia race to end racism. And so you'll see these beautiful, colorful shirts. And then you'll also start to see posts of these people marching and how the two go back and forth in the same day. To have that side by side picture and how it makes you feel. Because that's what we're talking about. We're talking about that healthy environment that's mind, body, and soul. And to know that there's strong women out there that truly understand and are working to bring it to us all is amazing. And I want to thank you, Georgia, for being in the spaces that you are. This is, I have all these distractions. There's so many things as an African American woman, and there are so many things that as a culture we've kept our eyes on. Environmental racism is a real thing, and trying to work and have the resources and time to work our way out of it can be difficult on different levels. But then there are people that I would say are privileged like you that have taken that time, and instead of just sitting in that privilege, you're taking it and making a difference and filling those spaces and gaps. And so all I can say is thank you. Thank you for allowing me this education. Thank you for opening up my understanding. And thank you for another chance to make another difference in my life.
You know what I think, Katanya? I think I need to interview you for one of our Praxis programs. I'm serious. I'd like to. Are you open to that, Katanya?
I am very open to any learning, sharing, any onboarding, because I think there are a lot of people who are at my level of understanding that can be afraid to move forward because I don't know. And the unknown can be scary. But it's okay to step out there in the abyss because they're going to be allies. And I'd even go as far as to say accomplices that'll be there to catch if you slip and fall. So thank you. Yes, I'd love to.
Okay, I will email you separately, Katanya, and we can set up a time to talk.
I have to let people know that both Georgia and Katanya are on the steering party of an economy of our own, and this has been a wonderful chance for us to know each other a little bit better. It's kind of wonderful. Katanya's done amazing work in West Virginia. I'm afraid we are kind of out of time. I want to thank you again, Georgia, and I just want to share a little bit about, I want to just thank everyone who came tonight. There haven't been a lot of us, but as the great Margaret Mead once said, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed individuals can change the world. In fact, that's the only thing that ever has. So tonight's conversation is part of our full-bodied Earth economics. Up on the slide there is a picture of our Earth Day conversation, which was about applying nature's balance to economic exchanges. It was wonderful also. And don't worry if you didn't get to see it. We have this one and 26 recorded woman-to-woman conversations about different subjects in economics, and it's a great way to learn and enjoy learning about what's usually impossible and difficult. So what do we mean at an economy of our own by full-bodied economics? If you read the fine print here, it says today's economy is so complex and abstract, its language needs decoding. What will it profit us to gain a global economy if financialization destroys health, vitality, and real productivity? All life requires our material care and attention. Money numbers alone can never create real, tangible value. Mother Earth does that, and people do that. So I wanted to let you know that on July 29th, we're going to have a full-bodied health economics conversation talking about solutions to healthcare financialization, which is happening now and making healthcare more unaffordable than ever. And they're thinking about patients as consumers in this market that I just described as an auction block. I'm afraid that's what it's like. And then we'll be talking in August about food and what's happening there, how we can have a full-bodied food system, and in September, how we can provide affordable and full-bodied shelter and housing, and that housing in Vienna is a part of that. There's a New York legislator who's looking into this for New York, which is kind of exciting. So lots of ways to stay in touch with us. Next slide, please. Whoops, what happened to the headline? That's interesting. Carmen, what happened to the headline on this? In Women We Trust, it should say up here at the top. And with that asterisk, and the men who love us, the men and all the genders who love us. And so these are different ways you can keep in touch with us and find out about upcoming Zooms and also other news from other members of our alliance. You'll see things about Praxis Peace Institute, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, the Women's Food and Agricultural Network, the Invest for Better, Women Investing for Change, all kinds of news of good news, solution-focused news. And we're just grateful that you found us tonight because you really are the change, all of us. Good night. Thank you so much. Thank you again, Georgia.
Thank you, and thank everyone on the call today.
Yes, for sure. Good night now. Bye-bye.
Bye.